The vending machine swallowed his last dollar and refused to give him the stale pack of crackers, and for a moment, Marcus felt as if the universe itself had made a decision about his life. He stood there in the dim hallway of St. Mary's Medical Center in Columbus, Ohio, staring at his warped reflection in the metal, a tired man in a wrinkled shirt that had once been white. His hands trembled not from hunger but from fear, the kind that sits in your chest and refuses to move. Down the corridor, behind a heavy gray door, his 8-year-old son Joshua was lying in a hospital bed, waiting for test results that would decide everything. And Marcus was alone. If you were in that hallway, with no savings left and no family to call, what would you hold on to? Pride? Faith? Anger? Or would you, like Marcus, cling to the thin thread of hope that something, anything, might change? Joshua had collapsed during gym class 3 days earlier. One moment he had been chasing a soccer ball, his laughter sharp and bright as a summer morning, and the next he had fallen, clutching his chest. The school nurse had called an ambulance, and Marcus had arrived at the emergency room still wearing his delivery uniform from the warehouse. Since then, the world had narrowed to fluorescent lights, antiseptic smells, and doctors who spoke in careful, guarded tones. They had run tests, blood work, scans, words Marcus barely understood. They had mentioned something about a congenital heart defect that might have gone unnoticed until now. They had mentioned surgery. They had mentioned cost. Marcus was 34 years old and had been a widower since he was 29. His wife, Hannah, had died in a car accident on an icy stretch of highway outside Dayton. The night the state trooper knocked on his apartment door, he had been holding Joshua, who was only 3 at the time. He remembered the weight of his son in his arms and the way the world seemed to tilt. Since then, Marcus had been mother and father, bedtime storyteller and morning alarm clock, the one who packed lunches and checked homework. He had worked double shifts at the warehouse, loading trucks until his back screamed. He had skipped meals so Joshua could have the brand name cereal instead of the generic kind. He had sold Hannah's wedding ring when rent had fallen behind one winter. There were no grandparents nearby, no siblings to lean on, just him and his boy in a 2-bedroom apartment with peeling paint and a leaky faucet. Now he sat in a plastic chair outside Joshua's room, staring at the floor tiles. The hospital television mounted on the wall murmured about stock markets and corporate mergers, a world so distant from his own it might as well have been another planet. Nurses walked past him briskly, families huddled together in anxious clusters. He watched a well-dressed couple in tailored coats speak urgently with a doctor, their hands clasped. He looked down at his scuffed boots and felt invisible. It was then that he noticed her. She stood at the end of the hallway, a woman in her early 40s with dark hair pulled into a sleek bun and a navy suit that probably cost more than Marcus made in a month. Her heels clicked against the polished floor with a confidence that drew attention without trying. But her face was pale, her composure brittle. She spoke to a nurse in a low, tense voice, then glanced around as if searching for something she had lost. Her name, he would later learn, was Victoria Hale, the CEO of Hale Biotech, a rapidly growing pharmaceutical company headquartered in Columbus. She had been featured on magazine covers, praised for her intelligence and ruthlessness in business. Yet in that hallway, she looked like any other frightened parent. Their eyes met by accident. Marcus quickly looked away, embarrassed, as though he had trespassed into her world with a single glance. But moments later, he heard the soft approach of her heels stopping in front of him. He looked up to see her standing there, her expression unreadable. She asked his name. He told her. She asked why he was there. He swallowed and explained about Joshua, about the collapse, about the tests. He did not mention the bills piling up on his kitchen counter, or the fact that he had just been warned by hospital administration that without insurance approval, certain procedures would require a deposit he did not have. Victoria listened, her gaze steady. Then she told him that her daughter, Madison, was 2 rooms down. Madison was 10 and had been diagnosed with leukemia 6 months earlier. The experimental treatment she was about to receive had been developed in Victoria's own labs, but even as CEO, she could not control the disease that ravaged her child's body. For all her wealth and power, she was just a mother waiting for test results. A silence stretched between them, heavy with shared fear. Then something shifted in her eyes. She glanced toward the cluster of reporters gathering near the hospital entrance. Apparently, word had spread that the powerful CEO's daughter was undergoing a critical procedure. Cameras flashed beyond the glass doors. Victoria exhaled slowly, as though making a calculation. She leaned closer to Marcus and whispered words that made his heart skip. She asked him to pretend he was her husband. The request hung in the air, absurd and surreal. She explained quickly that her real husband had died years ago and that she had always kept her private life fiercely guarded. The board of directors was watching her every move. Investors were nervous about the company's latest drug trial. If the media sensed instability, if they saw her alone and vulnerable, it could affect stock prices, funding, everything. She needed the image of a united family, just for a few minutes, just long enough to walk past the cameras. Marcus felt his cheeks burn. He was a stranger in worn-out clothes. He did not belong beside someone like her. Yet he saw the desperation in her face, the same desperation he felt when he looked at Joshua through the hospital window. What would you do? Would you refuse out of pride, or would you step into a lie to help someone who was drowning in her own way? He nodded. Victoria slipped her arm through his. The contact startled him. He could feel the tension in her body, the controlled tremor beneath her calm exterior. Together they walked toward the entrance. The doors slid open, and a wave of noise crashed over them. Reporters shouted questions about Madison's condition, about the clinical trial, about the company's future. Victoria kept her chin high. Marcus stood half a step behind her, close enough to appear intimate, far enough to remain respectful. He felt ridiculous, painfully aware of his scuffed boots and rough hands. But when Victoria briefly squeezed his arm, he realized she was drawing strength from his presence. In that moment, he was not a poor warehouse worker. He was simply a father standing beside another parent in crisis. They made a short statement, carefully worded, asking for privacy and prayers. Cameras flashed. Then they retreated back inside, the doors closing on the chaos. Victoria released his arm slowly. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then she thanked him, her voice softer than before. She asked about Joshua again, about the doctor's updates. When Marcus admitted he was worried about the cost of potential surgery, he hated the way his voice cracked. He had not meant to reveal that vulnerability. Victoria's eyes sharpened. She asked which specialist was handling Joshua's case. When he told her, she nodded, as if recognizing the name. She excused herself and walked briskly down the hallway. Marcus did not expect to see her again. He returned to his chair and waited, counting the seconds by the rhythm of his own breathing. Hours seemed to pass before a cardiologist approached him with a different tone than before. The doctor explained that Joshua did indeed have a heart defect, but it was operable. They had scheduled surgery for the following morning, and, almost as an afterthought, the doctor mentioned that a charitable foundation had agreed to cover the majority of the costs. Marcus blinked, confused. He had not applied for any charity. The doctor simply smiled and said that sometimes help arrives quietly. When Victoria returned later that evening, she did not mention money. She sat beside Marcus and told him that she had made a few calls. She spoke about how her company funded a foundation for children's medical care. She said no child should be denied treatment because of finances. She said it as though it were a policy, not a personal favor. Marcus felt something inside him crack open. Gratitude, humiliation, relief. They tangled together until he could not separate them. He tried to thank her, but she shook her head gently. She told him that earlier, when he had agreed to stand beside her, he had given her something she could not buy with all her wealth, the comfort of not being alone. The night before surgery, Marcus sat by Joshua's bed, holding his small hand. The boy's skin was pale against the hospital sheets, but when he smiled weakly at his father, Marcus saw the same light that had filled their apartment with laughter for years. He whispered stories about camping trips they would take once Joshua felt better, about fishing by a quiet lake, about building a treehouse even though they did not have a tree yet. Across the hall, Victoria kept vigil beside Madison. Sometimes their eyes met through the glass windows, two parents bound by fear and hope. They did not need to speak. The surgeries took place at the same time the next morning. Marcus waited in the chapel, staring at a wooden cross mounted on the wall. He had not been to church regularly since Hannah's death. Back then, he had felt abandoned. Now, with his son's life hanging in the balance, he found himself whispering prayers he barely remembered. Hours later, a surgeon approached him with a tired but genuine smile. The operation had been successful. Joshua would need time to recover, but his heart was strong. Marcus sank into a pew and wept openly, not caring who saw. Madison's surgery was more complicated, her condition fragile. When Victoria emerged from the consultation room, her face streaked with tears, Marcus stood instinctively. For a terrifying moment, he feared the worst. Then she nodded slowly. The treatment had gone as planned. There were no guarantees, but there was hope. In the weeks that followed, Joshua and Madison recovered on the same floor. The children became friends, bonded by IV poles and hospital boredom. Marcus visited Madison sometimes, bringing comic books he found at thrift stores. Victoria visited Joshua, bringing puzzles and warm smiles. The line between their worlds began to blur. Victoria learned about Marcus's double shifts, about the nights he fell asleep at the kitchen table. Marcus learned about board meetings, investor pressure, and the loneliness of leadership. They were both exhausted in different ways, both carrying burdens they had never chosen. When Joshua was finally discharged, Marcus expected to return to his old life unchanged. But Victoria surprised him once more. She offered him a position at Hale Biotech, not out of charity, she insisted, but because she admired his resilience and integrity. The job was in facilities management, steady hours, better pay. It would allow him to be present for Joshua in ways he had not been able to before. Marcus hesitated. Pride flickered again. But then he remembered the hallway, the whisper, the moment two strangers had chosen compassion over distance. He accepted. Months later, on a crisp autumn evening, Marcus stood in a small park in Columbus watching Joshua and Madison race across fallen leaves. Victoria stood beside him, her hands tucked into a coat pocket, her gaze softer than the day they had met. Life was still uncertain. Madison's health required monitoring. Joshua had scars on his chest that would fade slowly, but there was laughter in the air, bright and unburdened. Marcus thought about the vending machine and the last dollar he had lost. He thought about how close he had come to believing he was completely alone. If someone had told him then that a whispered request would alter the course of his life, he would not have believed it. Before this story ends, I want to ask you something simple but important. What would you have done in that hallway? And have you ever been the stranger who changed someone's life without even realizing it? Share your thoughts in the comments below. As the sun dipped beneath the trees, casting long golden shadows, Marcus realized that sometimes salvation does not arrive with trumpets or miracles. Sometimes it comes in the form of a quiet whisper, a borrowed arm, a moment of courage between two broken hearts. And if this story touched you in any way, if it made you believe a little more in kindness, second chances, and the power of standing beside someone in their darkest hour, please like, comment, share, and subscribe, only if your heart truly feels it.